Namaskar. Welcome to the 20th episode of Satya Samvad. Expressions of universal principles are seen in empirical phenomenology, just as the expressions of spirituality are seen in religion. Imagine a system where land is not just property but a contested spiritual trust, wielding immense social and political power. This is the concept of Waqf, now at the heart of fierce debates surrounding the Waqf Bill in India. Waqf, rooted in Islamic law, involves dedicating property for religious or charitable purposes under the Waqf boards, which today control vast estates worth billions. However, the controversy goes beyond land and legalities, touching upon deeper philosophical questions embedded in the Indian knowledge systems and contemporary global thought. Where do the lines between the spiritual and the material, the communal and the personal, blur? Indian traditions have long grappled with balancing material wealth and ethical duties, offering a stark contrast to Western notions of property as a mere commodity. Having said that, the debate around the proposed Waqf Bill highlights a certain ongoing tension, raising questions about transparency, governance, and the role of religious endowments in a secular state. At its core, it invites a broader reflection on the intersection of spirituality and physicalism, urging us to rethink our relationship with land, power, and communal responsibility, challenging us to redefine what it means to own, manage, and serve in the complexities of modern Bharat. To discuss all this and more, we have with us today Sri Mohan Sonti. I would like to welcome you, sir.
Namaste, Mrityunjay ji.
Namaskar. Sri Mohan Sonti is an undergraduate in chemical engineering with a background from IIT Bombay and Texas Tech, and is a certified yoga teacher, deeply versed in dharmic scriptures. Having grown up across Delhi, Chennai, and Mumbai, he brings a rich perspective on culture, civilizations, and the intersection of politics with tradition. So Mohanji, Waqf refers to the permanent dedication of movable or immovable property for religious, charitable, or pious purposes under Islamic law. Once established, a Waqf is irrevocable and the property cannot be sold or transferred, as it is considered to be held in trust for God or Allah. This creates a perpetual source of income or benefit for the designated causes, which is not typically found in other religious property laws that may allow for revocation or at least the modification of terms over time. So reports have shown that in India, we have around 8,72,292 registered Waqf properties, valued at approximately 1.2 lakh crores and spanning lakhs of acres of land, including mosques, dargahs, and graveyards. For an idea that seeks to establish community ownership in the name of Allah, instead of individual ownership, there has been an historical underrepresentation of women and various other questions relating to the social dynamics that revolve around the concept of Waqf. So how do you perceive the concept of Waqf in the context of modern Bharat?
So, in the entire Islamic thought process, to understand Waqf, we need to understand what is a jihad. Basically, in Islam, everything belongs to the Allah. So essentially, whether it is a land or any other properties or anything else that they do, including the people, essentially it's about everything belongs to the Allah, and ultimately it has to be a submission to Allah. So in that sense, we need to understand the idea of jihad and the past on how all these things have originated and how they see each of the countries, like for the Dar-ul-Islam and all of that. And we'll go into those details on how it originated and how they started. One thing I would like to say is the total properties that they own. The Indian Defense actually has currently about 17.3 lakh acres of land. The Indian Railways has about 11.8 lakh acres of land, and Waqf property has 9.4 lakh acres of land. It is one of the largest landowners, and it is one of the fastest growing and expanding. And the way the Waqf bills were passed in the past, in my opinion, is almost like a criminal act supporting these kind of a land mafia.
Right. You mentioned about the contextualization in the concept of jihad, and especially in the context of how political Islam has, of course, a very important role to play when we talk about Waqf in the modern context. So with the advent of Islamic rulers in the Indian subcontinent, Waqf seems to have been introduced from the very beginning. So early references to Waqf in India appear in the 14th century text, Insha-i Maharu, as per which Muhammad Ghori or Muhammad of Ghor dedicated 2 villages to a mosque in Multan, marking the beginning of numerous Waqf establishments during the Delhi Sultanate period. In modern times, things took a curious turn towards further entrenchment of the concept of Waqf with the Muslim League, which was established in 1906, and which played a significant role in reshaping the political landscape for Indian Muslims in the early 20th century. So, how did the foundation of the Muslim League and subsequent movements, such as the Khilafat movement between 1919 and 1922, influence the development of the Waqf legislation in India?
All right. So, can I just go with a little bit in the past on what are the thought process in
Yes.
general? So, the idea of jihad, I mean, in the modern times, they say there are multiple types of jihad, the greater and the lesser, and all of that. But those terminologies did not exist in the past. They all came up more recently, and they're all made up terms. The jihad originally, the first when it was coined, the verses were given. It was when Muhammad fought the war in Medina against the people of Mecca, right after they moved to Medina. So that is when the idea of jihad was conceptualized. It is about a holy war, an Islamic war, and it's always been that way. The idea of the greater jihad and lesser jihad, or the softer versions of it, it's about the spirituality and things like that. They're mostly found in Sufism and Ahmadiyyas. And Sufism actually rank extremely low in the Islamic hierarchy, and Ahmadiyyas are not even considered as Muslims by the Muslims themselves. So only they are the people who talk about that kind of jihad. But otherwise, jihad is just basically about a holy war, right? Now, the other important thing on why this Waqf and how it has spread in Bharat, we need to understand a little bit of the background. So Abu Hanifa, who is considered the greatest of all imams, the lamp of the imams. So he was at the time when he has met with people called Sahaba, which is basically the companions of Muhammad, right? So he is considered very, very authentic. He conceptualized and gave the idea saying that how they view the Islamic worldview of different pieces of land and different countries. So they divide that into Dar-ul-Islam, where you have a complete Islamic establishment, right? It's also called Dar-ul-Tawhid or Dar-ul-Islam. Basically, you have all Islamic principles. Non-Muslims, some of them can stay as dhimmis, as kafirs, as third-rate citizens, but that will be the Dar-ul-Islam. Then you have something called Dar-ul-Ahd Dar-ul-Ahd, and then you have Dar-ul-Harb, right? So the Dar-ul-Ahd is when they're not in the majority, but if they're allowed to practice the way they want it, and as long as they're given substantial amount of freedom to practice the way they want it, then they are at peace with them. Dar-ul-Harb is if they're not allowed to practice the way they want it, then the Dar-ul-Harb is the place of war. Right. So when the earlier Islamic invaders that you're talking about, obviously there was a lot of resistance. So to them, this is Dar-ul-Harb. It's a place where they go to the war. So it is not so much about they care about any people or land or anything, because it is almost their Islamic duty to go and slaughter and kill and fight and win over that land. So that is Dar-ul-Harb. But today, in the Waqf context, they are at peace because to them this is a Dar-ul-Ahd or Ahad. So it is not a Dar-ul-Harb. Harb is the war area. This is Dar-ul-Ahd. So Dar-ul-Ahd is where they are at peace as long as they're allowed to practice whatever they want. So that is where the Waqf comes in, saying that if you let me have my own personal laws and my own personal law boards, my own ways of managing the land, my own ways of doing and practicing my religion, then we are at peace. And if you stop us from doing that, then it becomes a Dar-ul-Harb, where it's a war zone, right? So now you'll see where the context of the Waqf board fits in.
Right.
Then we can go with the 1930s. I mean, your question on...
yeah. Please go ahead.
Right.
Yeah.
So then we come to the modern times of 1906 is when the Muslim League was formed. So you get the background on in the past when the Muslim invaders came in, it was a Dar-ul-Harb. It's a war zone. And once they captured it, it became Dar-ul-Ahd, where even if you had the Hindus, they were subjugated and they would let the Muslims practice the way they wanted. It is kind of the same situation now. In 1906, when the Muslim League was formed in 1906, right? Then you have to see that for some reason, Muhammad Iqbal, who is basically the very virulent separatist, right? For some reason in Bharat, and I still don't understand, as recently as even Manmohan Singh's government, they glorified his song that he wrote in 1904, Sare Jahan Se Acha. But right in 1910, he made that intention very clear. He called it as Chino Arab Hamara, Hindustan Hamara, Muslim hai hum, Watan hai, Sara Jahan Hamara.
Mm-hmm.
His idea of having a separate nation and separate things for the Muslims was very clear right at that time in 1910.
Mm-hmm.
So with that kind of a separation, then in 1913, so the Britishers also had the idea of Waqf. It's not an acronym. Waqf essentially, in simple terms, it just means like an endowment. Right? In 1913, with this kind of an ideology, with the Muslim League, they decided that we'll start pushing forward our agenda. That is where the 1913 Musliman Waqf Validating Act has come into force. So that is the beginning of how the Waqf has started. So
absolutely, I think it's very important that you highlighted the distinctions between the way Islam perceives different lands as such. Because having said that, you have different modes in which it was propagated and politically so in various cases. Now, coming to the British, because they played a very important role when it came to the ways in which personal laws, various different laws around religious endowments, took shape in Bharat. The British introduced various laws affecting Waqf properties, such as the Religious Endowments Act of 1863 and the Charitable Properties Act of 1890. So the British authorities viewed Waqf as, very interestingly, and I quote, perpetuity of the worst kind, leading to a pivotal case that reached the Privy Council, which declared Waqf invalid. So, going from there, where we're talking about perpetuity of the worst kind, how did things move from towards this the Mussalman Waqf Validating Act of 1913, which you mentioned in your last response, which marked the legal recognition of Waqf as a way for Muslims to settle property in favor of their descendants? What were the key legal challenges that led to the enactment of this legislation? And how did it evolve with the amendments that came a few years later in 1923 and 1930, if I'm not mistaken?
Correct. So the way the Britishers function is basically a divide and rule.
Right.
So in 1863, when they brought all the endowments acts, they have many similar acts. It's not just about the Waqf, but even for the Britishers, for example, the doctrine of lapse and other things. Essentially, they need an excuse to take over your piece of land and get a control over all the Indians. So that was their idea. And Muslims had a similar idea. So essentially, it is imagine basically two wolves fighting for the prey, right? So in that sense, they had some sort of a clash. It is not so much about they completely disliked each other. It is basically they have a common prey.
Right.
So Britishers actually wanted to grab the land in their own ways and get control over them. Muslims had a similar idea. So what they did was, by the time in early 1900s, we had people like Bal Gangadhar Tilakji, and it's about the Purna Swaraj. So obviously, there's a lot of things that are brewing up, and then the Hindus, after the 1857 First War of Independence, by 1900s, again, this team has picked up, and we are looking for a full Purna Swaraj, the complete independence. So that is when they said, all right, so we have an enemy's enemy. This is when I say in 1913, they started slowly supporting, even though they completely disliked it, because they're taking the same chunk of peace that Britishers also feel that I own this piece of land as well.
Right.
So they let the Muslims come in 1915. Mohandas Gandhi was brought in with a great fanfare, and who came and made sure all the Hindus will be completely calm and they'll be okay with everything, right? And the whole his proposition of the non-violence and all of that, the apostle of non-violence, and interestingly, the highest number of deaths have happened during that time. So this is how they brought this in, and that's how we got the 1913. And even the Britishers didn't like it, now you can see why it is like an enemy's enemy, right? So basically, they put all these pieces together. Now, 1923, what happened is 1919 to 1922, we had two things that have happened. One is the Khilafat movement, which Bharat had absolutely nothing to do with it. Nothing at all. The only people who have supported that is Mohandas Gandhi and, of course, some of his followers in Congress. But none of the other patriotic and nationalists has ever supported the Khilafat movement. They said it has absolutely nothing to do with Bharat at all. Nothing. So Gandhi started a non-cooperation movement in 1920, just about the same time frame. Now, obviously, some of the patriots are going to join that because it is anti-Britishers. So it made it look like they were supporting the Khilafat movement. Majority didn't. In fact, there are some articles that say perhaps Tilakji also supported it, but he did not. In fact, Bal Gangadhar Tilakji, he passed away in 1920s. right? This is under this circumstances in 1923. Once they consolidated enough power, they made some more amendments. Basically, they said all the government at that time, they said because there was, in fact, there's a lot of corruption in the Waqf board between 1913 to 23. So Britishers said, how about we consolidate and make sure they gain little more power, and we'll help them organize their whole documents and the whole process and everything. And that is how Britishers actually, and with the help, generous help of our Mohandas Gandhi and many others, the Congress Party, they decided we're going to help them out. And that came the 1923 amendment. Then 1928, but still, after everything is organized, the Muslims had their own quarrels among themselves, right? One point to mention is Khilafat movement. Even Muhammad Ali Jinnah, he said that is encouraging the radicals. This is Jinnah saying that it's radicals that you are encouraging and we should not participate. Right. To which Mohandas Gandhi actually participated, right? He tried to pull everyone into it. In 1928 came a Nehru report. Now, by then, already Muslim League was kind of falling apart. There's a lot of internal quarrels. And 1928 Nehru report says that we're looking for a dominion status from Britishers.
Right.
If you remember, a few decades before that was people like Bal Gangadhar Tilakji, they were talking about Purna Swaraj. Now, this came the dominion status, which means the Muslims will also lose the power. So now there is a big conflict. This actually consolidated all the Muslims saying that, no, we don't like this idea. The patriots were also against the Nehru report. Under this situation in 1930, that Muhammad Iqbal, the separatist, the first separatist, he actually proposed a two-nation theory. He still didn't call it Pakistan, but the name could have come later, but his idea of separate land for the Muslims. Then came the 1930s Musliman Waqf Act, Validating Act, in which they say that there is a retro effect, and anything that was claimed in the past, any properties that we owned even before this 1913 Validating Act, all of them can be brought under the Waqf. So that made the biggest step. So that is how the background, how it changed before the independence.
Right. And it's very important to know that, the way in which the British, entrenched, to use the words they used, perpetuity is of the worst kind. I mean, in terms of strategic, disabilities, or you could say weaknesses, which were entrenched within the political system, so to say. And it seems to me that, this was another such instance where, certain fault lines or fissures were kind of intentionally exploited for very petty political reasons, and which were further perpetuated by selfish political stakeholders. So during India's independence movement, the Waqf system, or the Waqf, idea of the Waqf also had a lot of contestations. I mean, there were, of course, a certain cross-section of freedom fighters which saw it as a critical institution for socio-economic welfare. Leaders like Maulana Abul Kalam Azad and others within the Indian National Congress emphasized the need to protect the religious endowments such as Waqf properties from the British control and exploitation. However, there were also, of course, glaring concerns about the mismanagement and underutilization of provisions and the thought that had to go into the idea of Waqf and how it was undertaken. But however, after independence, Jawaharlal Nehru's government passed the Waqf Act of 1954, aiming to improve the administration and supervision of the Waqf properties. So how did this act serve the socio-political interests of the Congress government at the time? And what role did it play in shaping the Muslim community's relation to the state in the very early years of after India's independence?
So the endowment acts that we just mentioned, right, in between the Waqf and what the Britishers did. So like I said, both of them wanted the properties, both of them wanted to grab a piece of land in Bharat. Now, what they did was the divide and rule. Even though the Britishers acknowledged that this is the worst kind, it is worse than just what they were doing.
Right.
But they figured that this keeps the country boiling. So that is how they brought in all the endowment acts along with the Waqf acts. Now, after the independence in 1947, we know that of the Congress committee, out of the 15 people, 12 of them have voted for Sardar Patel, right? And 3 of them abstained. But for whatever reason, Mohandas Gandhi decided that Nehru is going to be the prime minister. So he was a selected prime minister at that time. And promptly in 1948, he took the Kashmir issue to the United Nations and made sure that remains a permanent problem, something that was almost got resolved. So when the partition has happened, essentially Muslims always took care of their interests. They did that in the Waqf time, and they did that for everything in the past. So even after the independence, the Maulana Azad and other names that you have mentioned, all of them were just interested in the making sure the Muslims get their rights, and whatever Muslims want, they can take it. So there was actually no reason to bring any of the Waqf Act or the Endowment Acts. But what Nehru did in 1954 was basically the British Endowment Acts, which basically takes control over the temples and our lands and our religious institutions, and making sure that none of us can have our own universities and colleges and things like that that run on the Hindu principles.
Right.
So he made sure those British ideas continued. There was no reason to put that in place, but they continued the British ideas on how they grab it, and they continued the Waqf one as well. Essentially, it's a continuity of, it's really an independence where the Britishers have physically left the place, and that's about it. Otherwise, the principles and everything was just continued as if they were still there. And as if the Britishers, as well as the Muslims, were continuing to take over these lands and control the country. So that is what the 1954 Act was. And there's no reason to do that after the partition, because a substantial chunk of the land was given away in the name of Pakistan, East and West Pakistan.
Right.
So in 1954, that's what happened. And all the Waqf, everything that has done in the past, the retrospective effect and all the details, everything is consolidated into one beautiful large act where they say that pretty much all these things belong to the Muslims.
Right. Right.
And actually, we have to mention, besides the Waqf, also was the other endowment acts. The Britishers had it.
Right.
That they would take the lands, the temples and everything. Those were also there. Essentially, just continuity of what happened before.
Right. And so, I mean, decolonization was definitely, even till date, we have instances where, the defenses of arguments are so flawed in many ways. I mean, if you look at the contextual aspects that you just mentioned, be it around partition itself, or be it around the, regulation of property and various other resources that relate to communities and religion for that matter. Even today we are talking about temples and the recent, incidences that have happened around Hindu temples, and how things are skewed when it comes to the dynamics of different communities in modern India as such. Now, since independence, the number of Waqf properties, has been steadily increasing over time, leading to various disputes and issues relating to the ownership and management of the properties. This highlighted the need for a central authority to provide guidance and oversight to various state-level Waqf boards. Obviously, we are here assuming that the very basis of the Waqf Act of 1954 is assumed and is kind of taken forward. Now, under the 1923 Act, civil courts oversaw the Waqf management, but post-independence, Waqf boards gradually assumed the judicial powers, sidelining the courts in the Republic of India when it came to certain specific matters. So the establishment of the Central Waqf Council in 1964 was a significant development under the Waqf Act. So now, when it comes to such kind of decentralization and movement away from the central judicial system of the independent state, what were the intended roles and responsibilities of the Central Waqf Council, and how has it evolved in the governance of the Waqf properties over time, especially given the discussion we just had regarding the very basis and premise of Waqf itself in post-independence India?
So in 1954, when the Act was passed by Jawaharlal Nehru, the interesting thing is, we know that the Pakistan is already taken, right? It's West and East Pakistan.
Right.
So the Waqf was applicable to the whole country except Kashmir.
Mm-hmm.
The only place where you had the Muslim dominance, because they pretty much had the land anyway. Right. And that was proven in 1990 when every single Hindu was extirpated from Kashmir area. But that is the only piece of land where the Waqf was not implemented. Mm-hmm. That's pretty interesting, right?
Right.
And then in the rest of the country, essentially Muslims can have, remember the three categorizations that I mentioned?
Yes.
Dar-ul-Ahd, basically we are the rest of the land. Then as long as they can implement whatever they want. The Kashmir area is pretty much becoming the Dar-ul-Islam. Mm-hmm. Because the rest of the way the laws were formed over there, essentially it was under the control of Muslims. Mm-hmm. Right? They had their own rules and regulations, and it has nothing to do with the rest of the country.
Right.
If they hadn't complied to that, that becomes the Dar-ul-Harb, the place of war. So in the Dar-ul-Ahd, basically what they did next was on how they will expand it. From 1954 came 1959, where they said, How about, I mean, there are obviously disputes. Some people is going to dispute for the lands that are historical. It's retrospective effect. So they said we'll have a deadline, we'll draw a line and say after this point, all the disputes are null and void so that people don't keep coming back like centuries later. So that date was 1968. So in 1959, they said after 1968, nobody has any more claims, historical claims. Whatever is settled is settled. Then in 1964, this is one of the last things that Nehru did before he died. Is basically he brought in the 64 Act, the amendment, where he brought this under a minorities affairs ministry. Essentially, this is now escalated to being in the ministry level. It's almost getting intrusive into the government itself. So he created a separate Ministry of Minority Affairs, and this started coming under its purview. That is one of the last acts that Nehru did before he died. Now, comes 64 to 67. Remember in 59, I said the deadline was 1968. So there were still a few disputes that required a little more time. So in 67, there was an amendment to say, let us push it forward by one more year. And then there was an amendment in 69 that said, let's make it to 1970 as the deadline, and that's about it. So those were the remaining amendments, very minor ones, essentially saying when the disputes will actually end. So after 1970, it is sealed. Nobody can go back to the historical, the retrospective things and then have any disputes. Now in 1984 came Indira Gandhi. And again, one of the last things that she did before she died was basically bring in the tribunals. She further strengthened it and made the Waqf board. Essentially, you can see the Waqf board, they will make their claims. It's Dar-ul-Ahd, right? Basically, whatever I want to get little more. It's intrusive. So in 1984, it moved further and said you can have your own tribunals. So any kind of a disputes or any issues you have, these will be taken to the tribunals. And these tribunals are substantially maintained by the Muslims. So now they're part of the government. In 1964, they made it almost a part of the government where they were supposed to be advisory part of it. But really, it was more than just an advisory. Because once they became the part of the Minority Affairs Ministry, then they're already part of the government. And it's definitely more than an advisory council. In 1984, they got their own tribunals. See, that is how they intruded completely. Then came the 1995. That is where all the things have changed and reshuffled everything. Right? But this is the historical background on how they intruded little at a time, because it's like any other occupation, except this is a bloodless occupation. They didn't have to go to a war because we are a substantial number of fools to actually let this come and step at a time. Right? It's almost like boiling a frog in a water, right? It just increases the temperature gradually and eventually it dies.
Yeah, and that's the unfortunate bit that when we have that boiling process happening, I think in terms of the constitutional checks and balances, of course, when it comes to legislation and the judiciary, there seems to be a certain kind of maneuvering of sorts which bypassed the overarching kind of judicial system to create these various structures that you just mentioned about. So just kind of going back a little for the convenience of our viewers. So the original Waqf Act of 1954, which you mentioned about, faced issues like mismanagement and disputes, right? Prompting the formation of the Waqf Inquiry Committee in 1970, which exposed financial irregularities and operational gaps. So in the early 1980s, as you just mentioned, Indira Gandhi introduces the 1984 amendment to address these concerns and strengthen the support among the Muslim community by improving Waqf governance. And so the Waqf Act Amendment of 1984 introduces the idea of the tribunals. Now, to what extent do you believe that the strengthening of the Waqf boards and tribunals served the very specific political interests and dynamics, right, during this period? Because this was a period when a number of different, tugs, or so to say, political tugs were, happening. And there were various other forces at play. So particularly the consolidation of the Muslim vote bank, right, was very high on the Congress's, agenda and engagement plan. So how do you see this in that context?
So I don't call it as just making it better or providing, a strengthening or making it nicer for them. What they did was in 1954, what our constitution came into existence in 1950, and the first elections happened in 51, 52. So the 1954 Act was essentially almost like giving a part of our system and saying that now you have more powers.
Right.
And in 64, you're part of the government now, Ministry Affairs, Ministry of Minority Affairs. And in 84, the last act of Indira Gandhi was again saying now you have the tribunals. So it is not so much about shaping them and helping them. It's none of those things. It's essentially they wanted to grab a piece of it, a grab of the power, and then they got it. Because tribunals essentially say that now you have the right to govern things on your own.
Right.
In fact, the disputes to be governed by the Muslims. So there is no reason to give away the powers little at a time, and every one of them did it from 54 when things were established, which there is no reason to establish it. And in 64, the entire ministry was created. Right. That is the last thing that Nehru did before he died. And 84, they gave the tribunals, and essentially they are now into the judicial system as well.
Right.
Besides being in the government, there's no reason to put them into the judicial system. But that is the last thing that was done in 84. But in 1995, they revamped everything and created. So obviously, all of these things, essentially, they have been giving away part of our rights to the Muslims. So they keep voting for them. It's almost like, I will not create a trouble. Remember, the Dar-ul-Ahd is basically, I will not create a trouble as long as you keep giving me little at a time and I'll keep taking it. Right. So that's what the Congress government has been doing all along.
Right. And it's very unfortunate because it's like an almost like an all-consuming kind of beast that has been created for very parochial needs and requirements of the political nature. Now, a very, very kind of seminal or landmark moment in this trajectory of the Waqf Act and the concept of Waqf was in 1995, which brought significant changes. And I think you mentioned about this in one of your responses, including the formation of Waqf boards with the power to acquire properties, which with certain amendments in 2013 had expansive abilities and powers to acquire properties without challenge in courts as well. So the Waqf Act of 1995 built on the 1984 amendments, aiming to enhance Waqf governance with a more inclusive and transparent framework while addressing the communal concerns and inefficiencies in management, or at least on paper, that was the idea. So it was touted as the government's broader effort to balance community needs with state oversight amidst political pressures and communal tensions. Now, so how do you assess the legal implications of placing the burden of proof on landowners and the decision of tribunals being final without the possibility of a challenge in the higher courts?
Correct. So now you see, as they've been taking little chunks at a time, in 1990s, remember the 1954 where they said it's not applicable in Kashmir? Now Kashmir job is completely done and that all the Hindus were extirpated from there. So now like Pakistan and Bangladesh, where most of the Hindus are extirpated, the Kashmir is also pretty much belongs to the Muslims.
Right.
Then came the 1995 where again the Congress government said, let's get rid of all the previous so many amendments and everything. Let's redraft it beautifully and then give a lot more powers than what existed before. Essentially, it's rewriting. Remember, it's like writing a bunch of notes in your book and at some point saying that let me consolidate and rewrite everything. But this time you're adding a lot more new things to it. So you can say as a summary in 1995 Act, I would want the viewers to remember 5 things that happened. I mean, there is a very large act, a lot of things happen, but these are 5 key things, right? Number 1 is they said the Waqf boards can establish in almost all the states, right? The number 2 is they can actually make claims of the properties. So until that point, the Waqf wasn't voluntary. If the Muslims say 1913, the idea was if Muslims say, can I have my own ways of doing things? Can I have my own laws? Sure, why not? So that is how it started.
Right.
But now in 1995, they said the Waqf can proactively go and claim a piece of land and say this piece of land is mine, right? Because it had whatever the historical or non-historical, existent, non-existent reasons, they can make any claim and say this piece of land is mine. So that was the second part. The third is if they make a claim on the piece of land, the burden of proof lies with the landowner to go and say whether it really belongs to him or her, right? The fourth is when you have that kind of a dispute, you can only take it to the tribunals.
Right.
And this is in all Muslim tribunals. So basically, whatever the Muslim tribunals, which has one person who is an expert in the Islamic law, is the one who is going to make all these judgments and say whether it belongs to the kafir who is claiming it. And fifth is, now the tribunal judgment is pretty much final. You cannot take it anywhere else, right? So with these 5 laws, I'm pretty sure most of the Mughals would be like shocked and saying that, how come I didn't think of this? Because they didn't really have to kill anyone. You can just take over the whole piece of land. But one interesting thing I want to mention about 1995, there are places in some videos I've seen where they say, yes, it can be taken to the High Court. But I want to clarify that. That comes under Article 83, Section 9.
Mm-hmm.
All right. If you read carefully, there is a mention of taking it to the High Court, and people assume that, oh, so you can take it to the High Court. Not really. You cannot. If you read the section very carefully, it basically says there are only three ways it can happen. Either the High Court takes up the matter on its own, which is a suo motu case,
Right.
which will never happen. I mean, it is not from national interest or anything that they would take up somebody's dispute, right? The second is the board itself goes to the High Court, and why would they? They made the decision. That leaves us with the third option, which is the individual going to the High Court. Now, when the individual goes to the High Court, if you read the section carefully, it says the High Court, for the satisfaction of this person, it actually says for the satisfaction, it will do three things: the propriety of it, the legality of it, and the correctness. Right. It's verifying these three. It means, are the documents properly done? Is it legal? Well, of course, they have sweeping powers. Most of the things are legal. I mean, they just cannot do, I don't know what illegal there means, because they're just grabbing a piece of land and all those things. They maintain the legalities, whatever. They have sweeping powers over there in the tribunals, right? It's like another court. Right. So it is legal. And the correctness, meaning that if all the statements and numbers are correct, that is all that verifies. So people think it is like taking it as an appeal. Typically, an appellate court is saying that I didn't like the judgment of the lower court. So when the higher court takes up, it runs the whole case again, right? That is not what is happening here. This actually says it is for the satisfaction of the person who has taken to the court. It will check for these three things. It's almost like being the clerk. Is a front desk clerk who will say, when you go for a passport application, right? When you take all the documents, let me just go and verify if the documents are in order and make sure all the blanks are filled up. Right. It's verifying. That is the legality and correctness. But they are not the ones processing it, right? And the documents will be taken back to somebody else who's going to look for all the other details. Right. So that is essentially the High Court is as good as like a clerk at the front desk, just collecting the documents and verifying if all the documents are okay. So when people talk about you can take it to High Court, that is not true. You have to read the section very carefully. So this is the basic summary of 95 Act.
Right. So the third option that you mentioned, I mean, as per your experience in readings, where has the problem arisen? Is it because of very trivial kind of premises for the rejection of the consideration, or what are the different aspects because of which this has not, gone forward in the high courts?
So you mean this case when taken to the high courts?
Yeah, the option when the individual takes it to the high court. I mean, have you read about the various aspects of that? I mean, any examples?
Yes, the power is, like I said, it's in the 83, the Article 83 and Section 9 of it. Right. When you look at it, that is the place where it says it can be taken to the High Court. Right. But it's not going to be a suo motu case. It's not going to be taken by the board. Right. So that is the individual option. Individual option is just about verifying the correctness, validity, correctness, the legality, and propriety of it. Right. Yes. That is all that it verifies. So it really has nothing. Now, can you take it to Supreme Court? The cases, the High Court is the final authority over all the tribunal courts. A legal expert can say this, that the High Court is the final authority. So you cannot bypass a High Court and go to the Supreme Court. There are very specific processes in which you can go. It's in the cases where the High Court itself says to the Supreme Court that please handle this case, or few cases of extreme national importance, and there are few specific clauses. So essentially, it's not that you can take it to Supreme Court directly either, because you cannot bypass the High Court. High Court has done its job. So in that sense, it's very tricky way of putting it. If you read it, some people will say, I see the word High Court, so maybe you can take. No, you cannot. It's worded in a very tricky way.
Right. And I think it's in the the details essentially, right, where there is a lot of technical loopholes. I mean, and this is also seen in various other dimensions of modern Indian society and of law as well, where we are dealing with these loopholes in a sustained manner, unfortunately, even today. Now, in 2024, we have had these amendments, right, and especially the amendment renaming the Waqf Act as the United Waqf Management, Empowerment, Efficiency and Development Act, 1995. Where there are certain kind of transformative provisions. And there is one that obviously interests me, and for that matter, many people around the world, which is that, there's a major shift in the bill, in the inheritance of Waqf property by women heirs and the inclusion of women in the Waqf boards. So how does this bill address modern concerns regarding inclusivity, gender representation, and the involvement also of non-Muslims, because there's also a clause and a certain kind of provision regarding that in Waqf management? And what does it signify for the future of governance of Waqf properties?
So there is one more Waqf amendment, very significant one that we have missed is 2013.
Right.
So
I
what
mentioned it in
Manmohan
one
Singh
of the
government
questions.
did right before they left is basically 1995. I told you the 5 things that people have to remember, like a summary, right? And what they can do, that is pretty draconian by itself.
Mm-hmm.
But in 2013, what they did was they made it just worse. Basically, now that the landowner has to make the claim,
Mm-hmm.
right? He has to prove that land belongs to them, goes to the tribunal, which is all Muslim, right? And that is the final. Now, in 2013, what they did was they did 2 additional things. I mean, there are many things that are added to it, but 2 key points again, like the 5 points for 1995, the 2 points you need to remember for 2013 is, number 1, it is the government's duty to make sure the work properties are always profitable. So if they're not profitable, they need to pull in the resources and then make sure that all these repairs or anything that needs to be done, the maintenance and everything needs to be done to make sure it is profitable. So that's the job of the government. So the Waqf board can actually demand the government and say, this property is not profitable. This is falling apart. So government has to pull in the money and make sure those fixes are made on a priority because they have the right to demand the government. So now all of a sudden, it's more powerful than the government. And not just that, it can literally pull the collar of the government and start auditing the government records itself and say, show me all the records, show me all the property, the values and whatever, all the details, and have this audit system wherein the Waqf has a higher authority over the government for the state governments, and it can grab the state lands as well. In the 95 itself, you can grab the state lands, but now the government is answerable to the Waqf board. They are supposed to provide all the details, provide the audit records, provide the property details, provide any information that they have. And then when the Waqf board takes over, it's the government's job to make sure it's profitable as well. Now, you see what they did? They essentially made it above the government. Now the government is subservient to the Waqf board. This is what they did in 2013. That brings us to 2014. So in 2014, the first thing they did was they said, all the government properties will be taken back. You cannot grab the government land. The second one is, the original idea of the Waqf was any voluntary Muslim, he says, I will belong to the Waqf. Basically, I'll surrender to that. We'll give the property under the Waqf rules, which is supposed to just have their inheritance and other guidances in them, right? Based on the Islamic laws. Now the government said the person needs to be a Muslim for at least 5 years, a practicing Muslim before he can be part of it, which means what the Waqf did was, there are instances in Tamil Nadu and few other states where they would come and claim the entire village. And the entire village is theirs. These people have to vacate and leave. Or there is an option too. They all can convert to Islam and surrender to the Waqf, where they're at least allowed to stay there. And these villages, they have been staying for like probably 1,000 years or more, like thousands of years. So suddenly it becomes a Waqf property. So these basically, when there's a 5-year rule, this kind of nullifies that. They have to be practicing Muslims. They cannot simply say, okay, fine, I converted and that's about it. That is not enough. They have to be practicing Muslim for at least 5 years, and they have to surrender themselves and say, now I'll give it. Otherwise, that whole thing goes null and void. Right? So each of these little changes has a long-term implications. So they might seem simple. The other thing is the surveys that are done. Earlier, the Waqf can actually ask the government for all the survey records and all of that I told you in 2013. That will get reversed. And now we don't need that. Actually, government can do the surveys with its own, not their collectors and their choice, but the government can have its own IAS and other officers who can do that. The tribunals and other places, earlier it was all Muslims. And they had to have one person who is expert in Islamic laws, essentially a mullah, who will dictate what needs to be done with the kafirs, right? But now this says none of them have to be Muslims. It is not a requirement. And you don't need anyone with an expertise in Islamic law either. The other change is, now they added, we need to have at least, I forget the exact number, you need to have at least 2 of them must be women. Now, in original Islamic laws, women are basically a property as well. I mean, like the Waqf property, the women are also like a property in Islam. that is there for enjoyment. So they said at least 2 women must be there, and the property has to be inherited to the women as well. Because until now, they have absolutely no rights. So that is additional change. And further, they said we need to have at least non-Muslims, 2 non-Muslims in it. And among the Muslims that you need to have at least one Shia, one Sunni, basically at one from BC Muslims, the Pasmanda. Right. So essentially, it's empowering other Muslims as well, because there is rampant corruption within the Waqf as well.
Absolutely.
So there are issues. Yeah. The most important thing is, in the end, it says now the government can go and audit them to make sure the records are fine. Earlier, it is the Waqf Board that has actually almost had the power to audit the government for its interests. That's how bad it was in 2013 law. So now we say that no, the government can go and audit them, make sure all the records are fair. And the tribunals too, now they can be taken to the court, which means they can actually be taken to the court. It's not for some clerk work there, right? Not a friend desk clerk work that they just verify the records. This is something that you can actually appeal, like in a appellate court. So these are the major changes in the 2024.
So I just wonder, I mean, because in many structures across the world, we have various tokenistic measures taken, right? So on the surface, these are very, very encouraging kind of developments. Having said that, I mean, in terms of representation across the board, in terms of class and economic status, as well as, of course, of gender as well. What are the ways in which it is ensured that the implementation of this, which is on paper a very interesting and a very important kind of legislation proposed, is carried forward into implementation as well?
So ideally, I think these are the first steps. But in my opinion, remember the prehistory before the independence. So we had two things. The Britishers wanted to take the land, that is the Endowment Act. And then the Muslims wanted to take the land that was in their own Waqf. We didn't call it as Waqf, but basically what they were doing is just that, right? There is no reason to continue that after the independence.
Right.
So I think in the future, it just makes sense that all the citizens are treated equally. And the only issue with that would be, remember the three types of views that they have for the civilization given by Abu Hanifa.
Right.
Then this becomes the Dar-ul-Harb, as in the land of the war.
Right.
So other than that concern, which, I mean, they're going to fight anyway, either way. But I'm just saying, basically, all of them should be treated equal. Both the British laws, which is capturing the temples and all of that endowments acts must go. And in my opinion, Waqf Act, there is no such thing as making modifications and doing a better control and things like that. Eventually, all these personal laws, and you cannot have your own little country within a country. That's my opinion.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think, things which jeopardize or at least challenge the integrity of the country or the fabric of society within, must be definitely questioned or gotten rid of. Now, the Waqf system is, of course, deeply intertwined with Islamic jurisprudence, right? And yet these amendments that you just spoke about have significant, for lack of a better word, secular interventions, including non-Muslim representation on Waqf boards. Now, I would like to go into the very heart of this problem, which is that of state and religion, right? I mean, there has been discussion on the feasibility of, for instance, a uniform civil code in recent years and the potential reform or even abolition of specific personal laws. The debate on the jurisdiction of the state and of the religious authorities is at the center of how we conceive and conceptualize what we understand as the nature of reality in a secular republic with a strong dharmic mooring today, as Bharat is. So how do you reconcile the religious nature of Waqf with these secular legal reforms? And what does this signify for the broader discussion when it comes to the intersection of religion and law in contemporary India?
So I think the Uniform Civil Code and all of those things must come in, because if all the people are treated equal and much, it's more fair to everyone. Right. The issue with these kind of Waqf, as well as the other endowment acts, the British endowment, I would say the Britishers who brought in for controlling the temples. When all these things, when they exist, it is almost like running a country within a country. They have their own little ways of doing it. Right. In fact, that actually encourages the segregation and separation. The whole reason why we have the Pakistan, the East and West Pakistan today, the Bangladesh, is because they almost having a little life within the whole country as if they're completely detached from everybody else. So they cannot have their own little laws that way, because that is the separatist way of thinking. So I think eventually the uniform civil code must come in, so that they don't, the people are not encouraged to have a separate system on their own.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, this discussion, because when you talk about countries, I mean, some which are very authoritarian. For instance, in China, they have boards which authorize the nature of religious activities and what all goes on within the country. So where do we draw the line, right? That's a very important question. How do we draw the line? What is the premise for doing so, right? Is an important question to address. Now, as the Waqf system continues to evolve with these new legal reforms, what future challenges do you foresee? Because, of course, the abolition completely is one thing that you have spoken about, and various others have been as well. But let's say that we go ahead with the amendments for the moment. What are the future challenges that you foresee for Waqf institutions, particularly in terms of balancing the religious obligations with state-mandated governance structures? And how might these changes influence the broader discourse of religious autonomy in Bharat as we go forward?
See, the issue is, over the millions of years, the evolutionary process, the humans have become a lot more, they have a lot more compassion, sympathy, and there are certain norms that have been developed.
Right.
So these frailties, basically the softness of nature, is that we bring it in terms of, like, say, sharing with everyone and let people have little freedom, let them do what they want. So all these things are generally understood to be something that all of us share. But when you try to share with people, and if someone has an expansionist agenda, and they want to take away and steal somebody what others have it, then that is when we have a problem, because it slowly becomes, it has to dawn on people that the idea of fairness that we inherently understand, that we all can share the same space and all can share the resources, that does not exist for some people, because they inherently have an expansionist idea. Right. That I will eventually, I come in with the intention of taking over somebody else. In fact, one example I would give is, in our democracy, we all understand that everybody has a right to say what they want to say and then have as many political parties, right? And they're going to give their own ideologies. But imagine somebody like a communist regime, right? A communist parties. They have clearly in their ideology, whether they put it in the manifesto or not, that I do not like democracy and I want to get rid of it. If their objective is basically taking advantage of the democratic system and saying that I enter with the idea of democracy because everybody agrees that we all should be able to vote and have our own say. Right. They take advantage of that goodness and the niceness of the democratic system, enter into it, and if they had one power, they would have abolished the democracy. Mm-hmm. So that is a parallel system. It is not part of democracy. Likewise, the Waqf and other things, all the sharing and caring and all of that, the human mentality, the humaneness, the humanity that a lot of people have, their objective is actually expansionism, dominance, and taking over and eliminating everybody else. Mm-hmm. Right? When they have that agenda, it is actually creating a parallel system, taking advantage of the existing system, which is very accommodative. Mm-hmm. So we need to acknowledge and recognize this fact. Absolutely. Can they stop any of these things? Can they actually claim? When they say they take a pledge of allegiance 5 times a day, and it is a pledge of allegiance, which they call it as a prayer. When they say there is no other God but Allah, India is my country, all Indians are my brothers, that is a pledge of allegiance. What comes after that, they can call it as a prayer, but this is a pledge of allegiance. They do that 5 times a day. So when they take that like kind of an allegiance, it is entirely contrary to having this kind of a accommodative system. Mm-hmm. So we do have a problem. So there is no such thing as how do we make a little more adjustment. We can keep doing that, but I think it will strike when the moment is very opportune and it works out, because their objective is to expand. Absolutely. I mean, as I say, unilateral exclusivism, right? I mean, that has been the problem we have been facing for centuries, because, there is only so much that you can go ahead in terms of being accommodative. But if it is not met with that kind of a sentiment, you'll be at the mercy of, forces that are not very kind towards you. So it is very important to be, prudent and to be, having the vivekam, as we call it in Sanskrit, yes, to, discern between what is right and what is not.
So, Mohanji, it has been a wonderful discussion. We have, I think, covered a lot of aspects of the Waqf Bill and the amendments that have been proposed. Would you have any last thoughts for our viewers today?
Yes, what I want to say is basically we need to be wary of. There are a lot of these laws, not just the Waqf Board, like I said, the Endowment Act for the temples and all of them. Essentially, a lot of things have been carried over from the pre-independence into the post-independence as well.
Right.
So we need to be wary of these ideologies that are expansionist in nature, because the human mindset that is usually about the sharing and all the compassion and all of that, a lot of these don't actually they don't do it in good faith.
All right.
So something we need to be wary of. Otherwise, we are going to get back to the same problem again, and it'll be in a loop.
All right.
And
Absolutely.
so please read through all the acts that are there, the 2024, and please support it. And actually, the idea is if we can bring it into some sort of a uniform civil code. The personal law board also has Muslim personal law board also has a similar issues. So a lot of these little personal enclaves, let us not encourage on having a little country within a country.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. Beautiful words. And I think it's very important to maintain the sanctity and the integrity of the country and the civilizational ethos that we share. I think you mentioned a very important point on expansionism. I mean, in Sanatan Dharma, we talk about the inherent expansionism that we have because of our relation to the fundamental reality of the universe. And unfortunately, when the perversion of that happens, then we see expansionism in materialistic aspects. So I think we are seeing something of that nature, and to connect with our own civilizational ethos would be to go for the more spiritual aspects, maybe in some shape or form, rather than encouraging these perverted ways of exploiting the goodness and the very values that have maintained Bharat as it is for centuries. So I would like to again thank you, Mohanji, for joining us today. It has been a wonderful discussion. And I look forward to our viewers sharing their thoughts and taking this discussion forward, because it's such an important one. And hopefully we will get something meaningful in terms of rethinking or re-envisioning how we look at these regulatory frameworks and thoughts on that. So thank you again, Mohanji.
Namaste.
And
Dhanyavad.
namaste. And we look forward to having you in the next episode of Satya Samvad. Namaskar.